It's a relatively informal audience, so thanks very much for coming along. I should probably say that we've already talked at the big Northern Ireland Sexual Health Conference about this report. There were about 120 people who work directly in the field of sexual health who potentially could have been here today. And then there's Sexual Health Week coming up on the 11th of February, a big event in Stormont, where we talk about that as well. So we've done our duty in terms of publication. So yeah, it's a small informal event. I'm delighted to have Maeve with me here today, who's been working with us on that project. And we'll take you through basically how the project worked and really talk a little bit about the results, but it's more about the process of working with young people on a very sensitive subject area, really. So the background for that is really, and most of you, if not all of you, will be aware of that Barnardo's produced a big report on the sexual exploitation of children and young people in Northern Ireland in 2010. And part of that report was a module which was asked in the Young Life and Times survey at the time. That was the first time that a random sample of 16-year-olds in Northern Ireland were asked about the experience of sexual exploitation and sexual grooming. And last year we found out that a lot of recommendations were put forward in the report by Barnardo's. Helen Beckett wrote that. And of course none of that was put into practice. And scandal around particular young people who live in care settings was imminent, really, and came out last year. So the result is that we now have a big review on the situation, which will be completed by April, and much more work and more investment going into the area. Now, we had tried to have a knowledge transfer project before, together with Barnardo's in 2011, and the funding for that, unfortunately, we were unsuccessful. It was meant to be a joint project with Barnardo's and Brooke, and we've put in then afterwards for new funding with the Economic and Social Research Council for what they have, the knowledge exchange scheme. Basically what that does is it's a 50-50 funding between the academic institution and a voluntary sector organization or a department, government department for that matter. And we came together with Brooke, Northern Ireland, which is the largest provider of sexual health services for young people in Northern Ireland, to work on that project. And on that instance, we were successful. We had previously asked questions on sexual health in Young Life and Times before the big Barnardo's report in the 2011 survey. And that's just a snapshot of that. So already in 2004 and 2007-08, we had a sense that there is a proportion of young people out there who have sexual intercourse involuntarily or feel some sort of pressure to engage in sexual activities, although they feel they're not ready for that. In 2008 and 7, the figure was about 10-11%. And most of them were young people who said that pressure came from their own peer group. So we had a little sense of that work needs to be done in this area. But of course, the surveys that we produced in 2010 and 2011 were much more comprehensive. I'm not going to repeat all the results. I'm just going to give some snapshots to sort of set the scene for the project that we're really engaged in. And that's a snapshot here for the 2010 survey results. And we found that 1 in 9 young people were groomed by an adult. 1 in 15 had been taken advantage of sexually when they're under the influence of alcohol, solvents, or drugs. 1 in 20 had been offered something in return for sex, and that could be in oral sex, intercourse, touching, kissing, sending images, things like that, anything like that. Interestingly enough, 62% of those who were affected by that hadn't told anyone, neither a parent or anyone else of authority, that had happened to them. So there was a real need to enable young people to talk to someone who can do something about that. And we also found that 2% took part in sexual activity because they were threatened, or they were threatened that something would happen to someone they cared about. Now, if you looked at that in a little bit more detail, and there are not too many slides about that, we found that in 3/4 of the cases, the sexual grooming happened before young people were had reached the age of sexual consent, which is 16 years, of course. In Northern Ireland, no. There were questions about whether we really captured the issue of grooming and whether we really captured the fact that it's much older men usually, not always men, but usually approaching a much younger young person. And we found that in 54% of the cases of the grooming happening, it was someone who was at least 5 years older than the young person. 80% had been offered something for, 80% of those who had been offered something in return for sexual activity were also under the age of consent. And in 40% of those cases, the person offering this was also 5 years or more older than the young person was himself or herself. And the last slide on that, are there some people more affected than others? And unexpectedly, we could expect that females were more affected by those issues than males. But we also found that same-sex attracted young people, and you look at the second section now, the middle row, were much more, much more likely to be sexually groomed or being offered something in return for sexual activity. And again, probably less surprising, the people who came from not well-off backgrounds were more likely to be affected than those from well-off backgrounds. The outcome then, 1 in 8 actually engaged in sexual activities, either sending a sex, an email, conversation, or something like that. 1 in 12 of those who've been approached sent or received sexual images, and at least 6% had some form of face-to-face sexual contact. So we were roughly aware of the issue that was there. Just one slide here from the 2011 survey, where we asked the young people whether they felt comfortable to talk to people about sexual matters. And I circled the most important figures here for our project that we had. And the first two figures are that, and again, that's probably little surprising, that young people find it easy to talk to their boyfriend or girlfriend about sexual matters, or to someone who they regard as their friend. And although they think that sex education in school is the most reliable and useful source of sex education, they don't actually feel comfortable talking to a teacher about that. The teachers, in fact, are the least likely people they feel comfortable to talk about. So we knew when we approached this project, we had to look at that. And again, remember the 2007 and 2008 data about being involuntarily engaged in sexual activities. The two bold highlighted rows at the bottom there of this table show that we have approximately 11% of young people who really either had sexual sex with a person but didn't really want to, or they had sex because it happened against their wishes. And the figure shows again that females are twice as likely to be affected by that than males. So, what would we say we would do about that? When we wrote the funding application to the Economic and Social Research Council, we said we would basically do 5 things. We would try to aid capacity and confidence building among young people to negotiate situations like that. We would say we would increase awareness about sexual risks that young people may face. We said we would enforce the sexual health messages, and we said we would develop a young people-led publicity campaign and educational resource to address issues like that and make that available for other organizations or anyone really to use. That was that were the aims and objectives. In terms of the deliverables, Young Life and Times is a random survey, but Brook is a large provider of sexual health services, and they see a large number of young people, and we wanted to make sure that we really did capture roughly the situation for young people who are sexually active. And that's why the first step was to collect more data, basically duplicating the data, the questions that we'd asked in the 2 Young Life and Times surveys. And we collected 500 more responses directly from clients of Brook. We then went on to do 7 and that's where Maeve will come in later on in co-presenting. That's the stage then after the data collection, where we worked with young people directly who co-facilitated interactive group discussions with other young people, helped us to decide what sort of educational resource we would produce, equally what sort of publicity campaign we should produce. And we said we would hold one multi-format launch event. Now it's going to be 3 events. I talked about this earlier. So the seminar, workshop, and the sexual health week, and then the sexual health week next in February, another workshop. So the project was relatively small, and that's one of the issues about the knowledge exchange projects. You know, it requires co-funding, 50% co-funding from the other organization, and that is actually limiting for many organizations who basically don't have the cash flow. In-kind contributions are possible, but in-kind contributions are very limiting as well. So we had a small project. Initially it was meant to be from January, but eventually it started in April of last year. We had a very small budget. And we had myself involved from the university end, and we had a very lovely, nice, helpful placement student, Julie Eisen from a university in New York, who was doing a master's and came over for the summer and did excellent work for us, and basically all the data input of the surveys and helped us to design the focus groups and so on. We had the director and the manager from Brooke and I involved in the project, as well as the admin team, and this were literally all in-kind contributions. None of those people were paid for anything. The only people that were paid were myself and the peer researchers, like Maeve. We worked with those, and they predominantly named Maeve and John here, who stuck with us to the end, really, of this project. Okay, I go very quickly through some of the findings from the booster survey, which show that we picked the right organization to work with, which partially confirmed the findings that we had in Young Life and Times, but also highlight the issues before Maeve then takes over and talks about the interactive workshops and all that. So we had 26% of the YLT sample who said that they had sex. They were sexually active. Now, those were, of course, all 16-year-olds. You know, compared with the Brooke survey, the 500 people who completed the Brooke survey, we can see that a higher proportion of the Brooke clients were sexually active at age 14 or before. So that is really a vulnerable group who were affected by that. Now, 46% of YLT respondents said that it was 16 when they were sexually active for the first time. Now, there were some amongst the Brooke sample who were sexually active afterwards, but that's simply due to the fact that they see young people up to 25 years of age, so it's possible that. But the key finding here is that there is a higher proportion of young people who attend the Brooke clinic who are sexually active from under 14 years of age. In terms of sexual orientation, 8% of the males who completed the Brooke survey and 6% of the females had sex with someone of the same sex at least once. And we had 12% of males, but only 2% of females in the YLT sample who said the same thing. Okay, something that's really important for anybody working in the sexual health area, and it's an indicator for sexual health and well-being really, is the regret about the time of the first sexual intercourse. And we found that 34%, so roughly a third of the YLT respondents, but 40% of the Brooke respondents felt they had sex when they first had sex, it was too early for them. Okay, so again, an indication that working with this organization was a good choice because they see more vulnerable young people. Contraceptive use, of course, very important, and the proportion of people carrying sexually transmitted infections is rising. In Northern Ireland, people have become more lackadaisical about HIV because medication is now available, which basically keeps them alive. So we thought we had cracked the issue of contraception. People realized how important it is, but unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. We had 81% of YLT respondents who said they used barrier methods when they first had sex, compared to 74% of Brooke. Again, there's a lower proportion there. And over half of the Brooke clients had not used anything or could not remember, which basically, if you can't remember, it's bad news. It's very unlikely that you can't remember. Okay, so in terms of sexual grooming, again, there was a higher proportion amongst the Brooke respondents than Young Life and Times who had been affected by that. 17%, we're talking nearly 1 in 5 here who have approached, had to deal with that. 17% again from amongst the Brooke clients have been taken advantage of sexually, compared to just 6% in Young Life and Times. Almost twice the figure in Brook compared to Young Life and Times have been offered something in exchange for taking part in a sexual activity. And the only one thing where Brook stands out, and that's probably because young people are using a service, a sexual health service that makes them aware of that, there was a lower proportion amongst the Brook clients who said they hadn't talked to anyone about that. They were already in a service, so if that had happened to them, it was very likely that they talked to the counsellor or the nurse in Brook Clinic about that. In terms of sexual risks, again, twice the proportion, although it's a very small number, but still twice the proportion amongst the Brook clients have been threatened that they would be harmed if they didn't take part in a sexual activity. The proportion amongst those Brook clients or respondents who were groomed was smaller than Young Life and Times. That was an interesting finding. And 50% of the Brook clients had been offered something in return for a sexual activity when they were under the age of consent. And that was significantly lower than Young Life and Times. So whilst generally the Brook survey pointed out that there are real issues about young people at risk who attend the Brook Clinic, there were also information at the same time about the general sample. If you look back at the general sample of Young Life and Times respondents, that basically told us this is a real issue for people even if they're not sexually active. Okay, the last one then, the outcome showed that more of the higher proportion amongst the Brook respondents had engaged in sexual texts and emails after they'd been approached. There was roughly the same proportion of those who had sent sexual images, and there was a much higher proportion amongst the Brook respondents who had some sort of face-to-face sexual contact with the person that originally groomed them, even started a romantic relationship. Okay, Maeve, are you ready? Yes, so that's the point when I hand over to Maeve.
Hello. Hi, I'm Maeve. I worked with this project as a peer educator. I don't want to call myself something I wasn't. I was a peer educator, so I came in after Dirk had done all of this research with Brook and Young Life and Times. We basically worked with different groups of young people, showed them the research, and I should move on to this slide. We showed them the research and had a couple of interactive games with them to see how they felt about the research. We weren't really asking for their personal stories, but we wanted to see how they felt we could adapt the research into an educational resource. Before I go on, I got involved with the group through Out and About, which is a young project for women aged 16 to 25 who identify as other than heterosexual with Youth Action. The Out and About was actually one of the focus groups as well. I think as a young person, when I heard through the youth worker and Out and about this project, I've heard through my own peer group that there's generally a lack of education about what grooming is, and you hear from other young women but also young men of different stories that come through. People tell you these very casual stories, and then you realise they don't actually realise they're being groomed, or they don't realise that that's the difference, or they don't they're not able to identify where consent stops and where consent starts. Also, I heard through Gail that Dirk wanted the resource at the end to be very gender neutral and sexuality neutral. And as a young gay person, with young gay people as well, I feel like they're often ignored in research projects like this, but also they themselves, if they're not out in school, they're not going to talk to anyone. If they're not out to their friends, they're not going to talk to anyone. And I feel like that makes them a more vulnerable group and more open to grooming. So that was why I got involved in the project. So that was just the 4 stages that we used in the workshops. Introductions and ground rules, because we wanted to make it a safe space that young people could be open and talk to us. Talk to us about delicate issues. Obviously sex is a delicate issue, but grooming and consent and sex makes it even more delicate. And then we talked about the background of the project and the survey findings. Which is on the next slide. So I keep pressing the wrong button. Is it this button here? Sorry. Here? Mm-hmm. Okay. So again, as I said, it was just established groups that we worked with So Youth Action, Glenny, which is Gay Lesbian Youth Northern Ireland. So it was Out and About in Youth Action, so the Glenny and Out and About were the two LGBT groups, and then Include Youth, the Magdalene Centre, and then Brooke drop-in clients, who, as far as I'm aware, were mostly heterosexual, but obviously they could have been other sexualities in that. So we presented the data to young people through easy to read, I suppose kind of big boards that Shuli had made up. Some young people I found couldn't really deal with a lot of wordy data, so we had, is it in the next? No, it's on down, but we had like little figures of men, little figures of women, and you could colour code them and things like that. I noticed as well a lot of young people tend to like things in percentages, or like 1 in 4, 1 in 5. It was difficult to sometimes convey to them the different information that had been collected by Brooke and Young Life and Times, but I find that the big diagrams on the board seem to be better than a lot of statistics. So this is one of the things we showed them. Obviously, did young people feel they had sex too early? So you would have saw like the wordy kind of meaning of that Dirk showed, but this would be what we would have showed to young people, breaking it down into kind of manageable chunks, and they found that easier to access, I suppose. And again, this was, is this Young Life and Times or Brooke? It's clear from the diagram that the earlier the age that someone has sex, the higher obviously the level of non-consent, or that they feel like it happened too early. And we kind of established that 16-year-old was the age where most people felt that they were happy to have sex. The young people we spoke to kind of felt that that was roughly the right time, but the majority of people agreed that they knew lots of 14 and under that had had sex. And then obviously, judging by the diagram, the younger you are, the more likely it is that that's going to be due to grooming or some kind of non-consent. So this is the type of thing, again, we show to people. Young people find this a lot easier to access, and I think a lot of young people were quite shocked that there wasn't much difference between the statistics. I tried to work this out in percentages on the bus on the way down, so I'm sorry if they're wrong. But I worked that out, that the main reason why boys had sex curiosity was 56% of boys, and the main reason why girls had sex curiosity was only 52%. So there wasn't really much difference in them. I found that quite surprising, and I think young people found that quite surprising. I think it's easier to have a stereotypical view and think that only girls are going to be subject to peer pressure or grooming or anything that's going to limit their consent, when in reality, like the second slide, girls have obviously been groomed more. Again, I worked it out, boys were 4% had been groomed and girls were 8% had been groomed, but that might not be right. So girls are obviously a lot more susceptible to grooming, but there's still, I think, surprising that there's not much between them. I think boys being groomed has often been ignored in that sense, because it's very stereotypical to think that it's just girls, or to think that it's just girls being groomed by older men and no one else. So this was the first activity then we would have done after we had shown the young people the data. We had cards that they could hold up saying yes, no, or don't agree, or I agree, don't agree, and I agree. And we would say then, would you say yes to, and that was scenarios like this: your date takes you to a really nice dinner, expensive restaurant, and pays for you all night, so would you say yes to sex? And because a lot of it was, well, not necessarily anonymous, but because you didn't have to shout out, you just had to hold a card, I felt like we got quite honest responses. And they were all very mixed. A lot of young people felt, that they would feel obligated to have sex with someone if they paid for their dinner. Some people thought that was a ridiculous idea, and some people said no and then thought about it more and felt like, yes, they would feel obligated. Move on to the next scenario. So you're a party and your date's the only lift home. One thing was quite a while ago we did this, but I was trying to remember back. One thing I did remember was that young people seem to pick up on grooming and sexual abuse more if they were getting money or paying for something or gifts, but they were a lot slower to pick up on grooming or sexual abuse if it was something like a lift home, or this next one, you were the only virgin amongst your friends, so peer pressure. So so they were less likely to spot psychological pressure, I think, or peer pressure, or an atmosphere of pressure, rather than payment of money or an actual gift. And that's obviously where the danger lies, because people don't realise that. I think grooming amongst peer groups is not always going to be, I'll give you money for sex. It's going to be issues like this where the person has no safe space to go, and then that person invites them into a safe space, and that's where the grooming happens. So this is other yes or no scenarios that we show to young people. You feel like you're in love with your partner, and they say that they would dump you if you didn't have sex with them. So again, peer pressure and psychological pressure that's not necessarily obvious that it's going to take away your consent. A lot of young people were saying, yeah, but if you say yes, you've consented. And it was that point trying to say, well, but have you consented? Did you have the capacity to consent, or did that person limit your consent? Again, when it's boyfriend, girlfriend, we were trying to convey the message to young people that you might have consented yesterday. That doesn't mean you consent today. You can't consent for the whole relationship, and that each sexual act has to have its own consent. And I think some young people were quite shocked at that. It shocked me. And the younger they were, the young people that we spoke to, the less likely they'd seem to know about that. A similar issue again, you've gotten into a fight with your parents and you have nowhere to go. And I think girls, because it said older brother, or your friend's older brother, was it? Yeah, your older brother friend. I think girls were more likely to assume if a male was offering them a place in their bed that they could be subject to grooming. Other young males didn't recognise that getting into a bed with another male could amount to grooming or could lead to abuse. So again, it's that a young male may see himself as heterosexual and then wouldn't associate himself with being groomed by an older man. You know, so again, why we wanted our resource to be gender neutral and sexuality neutral. And the agree, disagree things. Put them all up. Okay, so the main issue here was really about consent with age. Obviously, everybody knows the legal age of consent, but also within an age gap, which it's difficult for a lot of people to understand, but I think with young people, we were trying to get them to think about where the age gap becomes too much, or where the age gap becomes so much that that person has kind of an undue influence or too much power over you. And a lot of young people obviously picked up on a 13-year-old dating a 20-year-old was too much. But some young people felt that 15-year-old dating a 20-year-old or 25-year-old was okay if they were mature enough. Obviously, contextual issues come into it, and we were trying to have a holistic discussion and looking into, well, some situations maybe, some situations maybe not. But again, like, it's okay to accept money for sex. They would have all said no, but it's okay for a 15-year-old to date a 20-year-old. Some of people would have said yes, because it comes back to, well, that young person has said yes, that young person has consented. So with our resource, which I'll come to in a bit, we went with the idea that it should definitely be educational to explain to people why you may have said yes or no to something, but you still may not have actually consented. It might not be real consent. That person might have put too much pressure on you that has kind of negative your consent. Educated? I can't think of that word, sorry. So the other agree or disagree activities we looked at, again, so going beyond the legal definition of consent. Is it okay for the person you're dating to be dating someone else at the same time? Is it okay not to use a condom or on occasion? Surprisingly, when we went to gay groups, we went to Glenny, well, Out and About was an all-female LGBT group, so that didn't really come as an issue. But in Glenny, young gay men seemed to pick up on the fact that condoms was particularly important to use. But I can't think of the name. What was the group in Port Rush? They were a mixed like boy and girl group, but they were quite young. I think the youngest member was like 14, and a lot of them said no, that you didn't have to use a condom. A lot of girls as well. So it seemed to be that message hadn't obviously got through from school somehow, or their peer groups assumed that that was okay to do. And again, the younger they were, the less they seemed to know about it. And then some people were initially very strong in their ideas, like yes or no, I agree with this, I don't agree with this. And then as their peers were talking to them, they seemed to become very quickly swayed, I noticed. So they were obviously swayed by their peer groups. You know, like someone's very drunk and agrees to consent. There was a lot of girls who were saying, no, that's not consent. But then you were getting other girls or other boys in the group going, well, sometimes, blah, 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 and they were just very quickly swayed. So I think that shows how susceptible young people's views are to that. They might feel that they know what consent is, but when they talk to their friends about it, I think they could be very easily swayed to the other way, to pick up false truths or stereotypes. So then we went on to the second activity, which was looking at this grooming line from Bernardo's. We felt that situations could start off as targeting. You know, the person who is the groomer, targeting that young person, maybe due to their vulnerability, maybe due to their isolation, other things like that. And then it could lead on to friendship, maybe even a loving relationship, and then that loving relationship becomes abusive. This is very important, I felt, part of the workshops with young people, because it's about young people trying to spot where those relationships become abusive, and young people trying to spot where those abusive relationships start. Again, looking at preventative measures. But it was very difficult trying to get young people to put scenarios into those 4 boxes. We ended up having to space them out so young people could put them in between, it's going towards that stage. Some scenarios did overlap, but it was very difficult to spot the warning signs of young people, especially whenever, and some scenarios will come up now, but especially whenever the perpetrator or the young person and the young person in the scenario were of the same sex, or whenever the young person already trusted that person. I think, again, you were getting a lot of these stereotypical views that grooming was like an old creepy man coming up to young girls outside school. They didn't necessarily realise that it could be someone that you love and trust. So like this is some of the scenarios we did. So this is the classic scenario: a 13-year-old girl notices an older man hanging outside school. So as far as I remember, all young people said, yes, that's grooming, or yes, he's creepy, and things like that. Would you go tell a teacher? Yes. So they knew the classic scenarios and they knew the stereotypical scenarios. But when you go on to a scenario like this, a 14-year-old girl is hanging out with a 22-year-old and she really likes him. He gives her gifts and things like that. She feels like she could tell him her secrets. There's been nothing sexual going on there. And young people picked up on that straight away, that nothing had happened, nothing bad had happened. But we were trying to put the message across to them that, does she have the capacity to consent, and is that age gap a bit too much, and where does friendship become something more? Again, young people were bringing up the argument, but she likes him anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And it's trying to put across, well, maybe she should be more aware of the warning signs, maybe she should tell somebody, maybe they should meet up in safe spaces. And it's one thing that a lot of young people didn't really pick up on is the fact that his age could mean that he would have a lot of influence over her. I think the age thing didn't. I would have assumed that people would have thought 14 and 22 was too big of an age gap, but a lot of young people didn't seem to think that that was the case. Another one then is a 15-year-old boy, and then the older male friend who picks him up from school. Again, lots of young men who we spoke to who were heterosexual didn't pick up on that at all. They didn't think that that was strange at all. A lot of people were saying, well, is Jonathan gay? It would make a difference if Jonathan was gay, because then he would be more likely to be groomed by the man. And we were trying to get across, well, it doesn't really matter about the young person's sexuality in that instance, because you can't pick and choose who you're going to be groomed by. The older man has has targeted him. He hasn't targeted the older man. And then the issue of vulnerability because the young person's being bullied in school. And again, the statistics have shown that, but it's young people from more difficult backgrounds who are more vulnerable to being groomed. This is a longer one now. The issue of a young boy again and a male coach who has targeted him or taken special attention to him. Some young people picked up on the relationship of power and authority over someone else, but a lot of young people didn't see that. They didn't, it wasn't like a teacher-pupil relationship. I think because it's less formal and it's within a football team, it's outside school. They didn't really see that it had a potential to be an abusive relationship. Some older young people did, some younger young people did not. Again, it's about looking contextually. It might not be a grooming issue, but the whole point of our resource is to try and educate young people to see when it does become abusive or how they can protect themselves to stop it going through those 4 stages. And so then we discussed what we thought the resource would look like. At the end, the big debate, I suppose, amongst our group was whether it should be preventative or whether it should be supportive of young people who have been groomed and have been sexually abused. I think towards the end we did agree that it should be preventative because the workshop had showed us that young people they found it very difficult to work out whether an incident was just friendship or whether it was grooming. They couldn't seem to put it within either box. And they were limited by stereotypical views of older men and younger girls, and they didn't really pick up as quick as what I would have expected on vulnerabilities of young people, vulnerabilities of someone who's been bullied, and how isolation can factor into that. So we decided to go with a preventative resource. Obviously there's issues, as Dirk said, with funding. The easy thing to do with young people is to go with an online resource or an app. But young people don't want to pay for an app or don't have the means to pay for an app. And as the research shown, it's young people from more economically difficult backgrounds that are really vulnerable to this. So you can't really charge them for any resource. So it's very difficult for us to try to think of something we could make with the limited money we had that we couldn't, it was going to be free for young people to access. So eventually we did come up with, there's a link to it here. Eventually we did come up with an interactive website rather than an app that young people can go on. Again, with preventative issues, so we're going to go through the 4 stages, explain to young people what grooming is, what does it look like, what friendship is, what does it look like, and how does that differ from grooming, because that was the main issue, and how does a loving relationship differ from an abusive relationship. And that abusive relationship doesn't have to be physical and sexual, it can also be psychological. The difficulty with the draft resource, however, was the fact that we wanted it to be gender and sexuality neutral so that it could apply to young LGBT people, because obviously they have been ignored by some resources in the past, but also how it was going to apply to 14-year-olds and then 16-year-olds or 14-year-olds maybe with slight learning difficulties or maybe they haven't had educational access as other 14-year-olds. So I'll open up the draft now. Oh. Shall I try again?
Maybe not online, are we?
Oh. Sure, I'll just explain it then. It's a live website, so the young person will go on, click on wee things, and wee things will pop up, wee bits of information will pop up, keeping it colourful and educational at the same time so that it will be accessible to most people. Again, using a lot of statistical diagrams rather than wordy statistics, because we found from the focus groups that young people like diagrams. But then we kind of went with this idea, well, how do we keep it gender neutral? So the designers came up with this idea of monsters. So they're like characters more than human beings, but they have any human faces. And it's trying to convey that it could be a man or a woman, or 2 men or 2 women, and you're not really sure the ages of people either. But then as we were
I'll just try to get
no, it's
it
okay.
going.
As we were looking at the draft, when that came back as like a prototype, then we weren't really sure if that was too childish, because you don't want. A lot of young people in the focus groups, I was quite surprised at their lack of education or their lack of understanding and things like that. But there obviously is very mature 16-year-olds, and you don't want to patronise people. And so it's difficult to try and find that balance. So I'm not really sure what's happening now. I think we're just trying to the layout and the fact that it's interactive is a great part of the resource, but I think we might have to look through the different characters and try and find that balance, that you're not patronising young people and they realise that you're actually on their side and you're not trying to police their activity. Because obviously they're still young people and they still want to have sexual exploration and things like that, but trying to convey to them the preventative information at the same time. It's okay if it doesn't
Right.
come up,
Yeah.
it's fine. I'll just leave it like that because I don't know how to get back up. So the benefits and challenges of the whole project, or my part of the project that I came in at, was putting that research into practice, getting young people's feedback and thinking, well, what could it be? Should it be preventative or should it be supportive? We felt like maybe there might already be supportive things out there, and preventative issues or preventative education is where the real gap is. The capacity building amongst all participants was the benefit, and the strength of different organisations coming together. Obviously we had Brooks support at all time, and that's their area of expertise. The challenges was definitely recruitment of peer educators. I think it's highly important when you're talking to young people to have young people in that group. I think the young people that were in our research group probably wouldn't have opened up if there wasn't other young people there. And I definitely felt it was important for me as a young gay person to be at the two LGBT groups. I think young LGBT people will really only open up once they realise that somebody else is there who really understands them. I think young LGBT people are often very embarrassed about talking about anything to do with sex because they're told all the time that it's weird or it's wrong. So creating that safe environment and creating that, I suppose, just support network within the wee hour or 2 hour sessions that we did, to let young people know that they could say their honest opinion, that nobody was going to shout them down, and that we did understand that they might not know the answers to different things. However, Dirk and the Brooke team, I mean, at the start there was 7 or 8 peer researchers, and then towards the end there's just me and John. And we were the older ones, and we were the 2 that were at university, out of all of them. Which is sad, because obviously those other young people could have got a lot out of it, but I think the trying to get everybody together, trying to meet up, and the lack of funding, and I think just young people's drive to keep going at it sometimes is difficult to get. I think that's obviously really difficult to get for researchers if you're trying to get young peer researchers to help you out, but at the same time it's necessary, so it's like a double-edged sword, I suppose. But the timing of the workshops fell into the summer months. That's obviously another reason why young peer researchers couldn't really get involved, and the very small budget at the end was very difficult for us to try and find something that looks really good but is on a shoestring, I suppose, at the same time. And is that the last slide? That's the last. So if there's any questions. That's it, that.
Thanks. I feel like I should sing. My name is Gemma Carney from Queen's University. That was really interesting. Maeve, it's kind of a question to both of you, and what kept springing to mind is the whole way through it is such a carefully done piece of work. But how do you manage to inform young people about protecting themselves when it comes to having sex, but also that without giving the message that all sex is bad? Because at some point you do want them to enter into good functional sexual relationships and produce the next generation. So do you see what I mean? How did you get that balance?
I think with the Bernardos, the 4-stage thing was very important because there was friendship and love. So there's too bad and too good. Again, like at the start, I think because young people knew we were there to talk about sexual abuse, they were all putting them in grooming or they were all putting them in sexual abuse. And it was for us to kind of turn around and say, well, that can be okay. You know, that person just needs to make sure that they're always consenting and they're always happy in that relationship. But there was a fine line, and it is difficult to try and put a lot of preventative education in without making it look like all relationships are bad, I suppose. But there was some scenarios, but there was a lot more scenarios than that in the peer research groups, and there was some scenarios that were, I don't want to be like okay, but they were just normal, consensual, loving relationships. And so I think that's why we stuck with the 4 Bernardo's sections, I suppose, and the interactive website, if it had come up, there was 4 different pages for that. So there is 2 where it's saying this is friendship and this is a relationship that's okay and this is not abusive. Because it's definitely important for that. I think it's important to show that there's 2 sides to it as well, and for young people to see what is consensual and what is a good relationship and what is a healthy relationship. I think a lot of sex education is to do with STIs, you know, it's to do with biology, it's not to do with a healthy relationship. So I think that's definitely another area as well to talk about a young or a healthy psychological side to a relationship or a healthy balance to relationship, friendship with young people.
Well, maybe just to add to that, I mean, Brooke National, but also in Northern Ireland, is known as a sort of a sex-positive organisation. And they have a campaign, even called "We Can't Go Backwards," known as "Sex is Bad Backwards." So generally, it was a good organisation to work in, but on the other hand, that's a serious issue we have to deal with, and as Maeve absolutely correctly pointed out, it's about helping young people to develop their capacity to negotiate healthy sexual relationships, and that's what it really was about. It was not about you must not do this or that or the other. It's about capacity development, and that's what we really did try to achieve.
I'm sorry we hadn't got the link to the website, but is it the aim of the interactive website that it'll be used by young people's organisations or by schools or by both, or, you know, I know it was limited by the finances available, but where are you hoping this is going to be used?
Well, it's a website that will be hosted through Brooke, the organisation, and will be linked through their Facebook website, the Facebook page, and so on, and will be promoted at the Sexual Health Week when it's finished. And I'm sorry about that, but it's not the finished product, so maybe it's not so bad that we couldn't show it today.
We get on the wireless,
we can have a look, but it'll be finished in sort of 3 weeks' time. And then it's free for anybody to use or to link to, and it is, as Maeve rightly pointed out, it's about the journey really that young people take in negotiating sexual relationships. So there's a section on love and relationships, and it's a mixture between those scenarios and the facts and the figures that we've collected. And then there's also a section on help seeking with contact numbers and so on, that we maybe the out and about or the youth action or the Brooke counsellor numbers and so on, and where help information can be sought if necessary.
Thanks very much. That was so interesting, really, really interesting stuff. I suppose 2 things. One is, you know, obviously you've talked about that you have limited money or resources, and that maybe the website, you know, that you're working on is because of the limited resources. But I'm interested in what other ideas maybe were coming up that if you didn't have the limited resources, that kind of caught the imagination of young people. So that's the first thing really. And I suppose the other thing really is that maybe as a parent as well, I'm really struck by how difficult it is to encourage children and young people to not be compliant with those older people in power, and just how unbelievably difficult it is to build that capacity, and just anything that was coming through from the young people that might help you to find a way through that. How can you, or how can we as workers really build that capacity that you were talking about, Dirk, about combating some of those, or being able to stand up for yourself, you know, against peer pressure or whatever it is, maybe. So.
Well, with regards to like their capacity to, with young people's capacity to stand up things, it was really difficult because young people just feel so embarrassed to talk about sex stuff. I don't really know why that is. It's obviously a cultural thing, and it's obviously a cultural thing that young people have been told that you can't stand up to people and you can't question things. And I think it's definitely, I think I've noticed within the youth work sector, I'm trying to pick up my own thing, but within the youth work sector, there's a lot of empowerment of young people that go on, and it's really about, I think you do need older people. I think you need youth workers, social workers and other teachers to try and empower young people to let them know that they can question things. And I think it's quite simple. I think someone just needs to say it to young people. I think young people never get told that. You can question things, you can ask things, you can talk to people, and I think they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. I think young people are afraid of saying the wrong thing, or young people are afraid that no one will believe them. And it's quite, I mean, it's quite cliche, but it's true. And so I think it's letting young people know that there's that support network there, and that they will be believed, and that a lot of things that they will say will be confidential. What was the first question?
Just
Had
about
something
the
to say about that?
resource, were there other ideas?
Oh, the one thing that did come up was, I don't know if you've seen them, but there's TV adverts of like the young man looking at himself through a panel of glass, you know, that he can see himself being abusive towards the girlfriend. A lot of young people had picked up on that. They thought that that was a really good resource, so then we did go through whether we should have actors and do like a short film or a short, and then obviously then it was a budget thing that came down to it, and then also do people want their face to be on something like that, you know. But I think if we had a really big, like an unlimited budget, you probably would go for something like that, like a short film with people in it, because I think you recognise human faces more and you remember stuff like that. Young people definitely remembered those adverts. Those are the big things. Like, this is abuse. And I think that would have been, if you could have got something on TV, you know, I think that would have been the thing that would have got young people talking. So.
Elizabeth, I'll probably just add to that a little. Mick has mostly covered it already, but one thing I want to say, last year, the Festival of Science event, we had a big event for teacher training on sexual relationship education, and there were a lot of teachers there who either sent emails afterwards or put in the evaluation sheets that they really enjoyed the day. You know, we had different organizations presenting there, including LGBT information. You know, Amanda was there from YouthNet, and talking about their resource. And we had Brooke there, we had the FPA there for the young women's work that they do, and but also the Department of Education. And a lot of teachers said afterwards, "That's great, we enjoyed the day, it's wonderful, but our ethos of the school just doesn't allow this to happen." So whilst they all recognize that this is really important work, the preventative work, it seems that the ethos of the school sometimes is a boundary. And whilst ideas came up, a lot of young people said as well, you should come into schools, we should have those workshops in schools, we should talk about that. And an organization like Brooke, which is, you know, positive sex organization, if you like, but a capacity building organization, finds it incredibly difficult, and often still sex education is a one-off assembly hall event. You must not do this, and that's just not good enough. So the option really was to produce an online resource that young people can access themselves, and in combination with a poster that will produce like a screenshot essentially of the website that will be distributed to organizations and so on. Hopefully young people will see that. And in terms of the resources, I should probably say we had £6,000 to produce that whole thing. That was all there was. And And then the resource, and I put an extra £2,000 in to develop that resource. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible. And that's just due to the funding structure of those knowledge exchange projects, which really puts young, small organizations at a disadvantage who simply don't have the cash resources to work on that. But we felt it was very important to do that.
Suzanne Huschke, Queen's University. Thank you very much for this presentation. That was very interesting stuff, and I really like that you both presented it together, and you rarely see that in you know, these types of presentations. I actually have a question about the surveys that this tool came out of. So you talked a lot about how the differentiation between grooming, relationships, and friendships is very difficult, and a lot of young people might not feel they really know when is it abuse and when does it start and where does it end and all these things. But then in the survey, you kind of present the data on this amount of people has been groomed or has experiences with this. So I was wondering, how did you ask that in the survey, and how do you actually know that people really said what they experienced, or how does that relate to actual experiences of people?
We gave them a definition at the start before we asked the question whether they experienced grooming. It was a short definition, what we meant by that. You know, it wasn't about you know, being. I mean, we had the actual grooming issue, but then we also had the exploitation by people of the same age. So, but we gave them a definition at the start, and we worked on that with Barnardo's, who is probably the organization with the most experience in working in this area. So, and that worked quite well.
And just from my own understanding, because I don't think I could define grooming, really. And I don't work in this field, I work on prostitution and sex work, so it's related, but it's not that. So from what I understood now, the difference is that in grooming, the person who grooms someone else has that in mind when they first approach the young person.
Exactly,
so it's not something, it's different from a relationship that turns into an abusive relationship because of whatever.
Yeah.
It's the intent, right? Is that the difference?
It's from the groomer point of view, you know, the intent, you know, the target for sexual exploitation, but that's not how it usually starts. It may start with gifts or presents or developing a friendship with the end game to basically have a sexual relationship of one kind or another. Yeah.
It was probably more a comment than a question about the kind of focus groups that you did with the young people. It's something that appeared to come out maybe from what you were saying is this notion of stranger danger. When we think of grooming, when we think of exploitation, we think of strangers. And just perhaps the value then of the actual focus groups or the interactive groups themselves for exploring some of those issues.
Yeah, no, that was definitely, it was, you could tell the stereotypical views that had been portrayed to young people, obviously through things like that stranger danger, even though I don't even think that was a TV advertisement, wasn't it? Or something. I remember, like, I think that was like my mum's generation heard that, and that's obviously been passed down to us. I don't remember ever seeing a poster or anything with that on it, but I've always thought that. And a lot of young people were very shocked to hear that your boyfriend or girlfriend could be the person that abuses you. And again, that whole if you say, well, what is abuse within a relationship, they would have thought domestic violence, not pressure and psychological influence and different things like that. So it's trying to open young people's eyes that there's a spectrum of abuse, you know, and it's not just this like tiny little thing. And because you've consented to be in a relationship with someone doesn't mean that you consent to everything within that relationship. And again, I think with young LGBT people, that was like not there at all. You know, nobody had addressed that at all, because even if you do have a slight bit of sex education and skill, it's never going to be LGBT. And one thing I don't think I thought about this at all until you were up speaking there now. Within schools, they have the CK2 or C2K filter, and anything LGBT gets filtered out. So that's the big thing as well. If you type in, like, even if you went on Stonewall, you know, even if you went on Wikipedia and looked up like LGBT pride marches or anything like that, it would all get, it just gets blocked, so you can't see anything like that. And I think anything with sex as well just gets blocked, even when you're like in upper sixth, you know, and you're sitting in the school library or you're on the school Wi-Fi but on your phone. So I think that's another barrier to access like things like this, is that if the only education they're getting is biological and at school, but they can't even look things up at school. You can't look up anything to do with that.
Will they be able to access your resource then?
I just thought of that, and I was thinking, we shouldn't tag LGBT in it. Well, I think there's ways of getting around that. I think if it's tagged as like if you type in anything, but it used to come up blocked due to gay and lesbian content. And that's still the case now, definitely. It's all schools obviously have bought this resource and it just blocks everything. So
I just wondered if anybody in the audience knows what the link is between this sort of work and the training that organisations are doing in terms of child protection and safety and all of that. Because I know a few years ago I was involved in training in Donegal, not in the north, and there was very little emphasis on the subtleties, if you like, of what grooming is and within relationship dangers and consent and so on. I'm just wondering if anybody knows if that is becoming more and more included in the training around child protection, or is that something that's a concern?
Well, I guess I could just from Youth Action's point of view, in terms of the emphasis of the training may not necessarily be, it's not necessarily in the keep and safe training manuals, but I know that whenever the child protection officer in our place is doing work, that she's very much of the view that the best protection is youth development and the development of young people's abilities and skills. And so when you do child protection training with other volunteers or workers, people are very scared leaving, they're panicked, they're looking out for warning and danger signs, but very much along the lines of stranger danger, look for the paedophiles, that are walking around with long Mac coats, rather than closer to home, the dangers of, relatives, friends, whatever, and the subtleties of what you've described. So I suppose it's just a change of culture in terms of how we do child protection, is that we're always, rather than shutting down and trying to scare the life out of people, that if we started to build young people's capacities, that definitely is one of the best strategies towards child protection as well.